All right, welcome everyone. This session is called Outside Looking In. We're going to be talking about organizational bias and user-centered strategies. Just as a note, as part of our introductions, neither of us are experts in organizational bias. I would not even consider myself an expert in some of the techniques we'll talk about, but I am an expert in slogging through organizational bias. So my name's Eric Davila. I'm a digital strategy contractor. I'm working mostly with UC San Francisco IT right now. Prior to that, I spent 16 years working in a department web shop at UCSF. So I have a lot of experience with some of the things we're going to talk about here.
And I'm Dana Adams. I work at UCSF. I'm a product manager. I've been there 8 years. I've been working in web and application development for over 20 years. I don't really know what the exact number is. And I've been working with Drupal since 2008. This is actually my first bad camp, so excited to have finally done this. As a product professional, I'm often accountable for any deficiencies in delivery. And my job is to figure out why did those deficiencies happen and how do we stop them from happening in the future, which is why I'm very, very curious about bias, how it operates, and what we can do to mitigate it.
All right, before we dive in, just want to again thank our sponsors for Bad Camp today, tomorrow. None of this would happen without them making this and keeping it free and available, so really appreciate them. All right, so tell me, has this kind of thing ever happened to you? You're working at your day-to-day job. Maybe you're running a website for a school at a university, and you've been operating under the assumption that the faculty are your most important audience, and you're creating lots of your content for the faculty. You're making the website structures for the faculty. And then you start doing a little research and you realize faculty don't read their email and they don't go to the website. We're not reaching them at all by this. Why have we been doing all this? Or maybe...
Yeah, but a little bit of a different story. I used to work for a digital engagement agency. We did multi-format engagements for our clients, which meant we would do web, app, on-site, all that kind of stuff. And one example, or actually before I even get into that, my team, because we did a lot of work with agencies like the UN and big multinationals, had to take into account multilingual. They were generally pretty sensitive to building usable interfaces. So better than average, I would say, at the time, and this is back in 2010-ish. We had a customer, and we were doing a youth engagement platform for them, and we had an on-site. And we did all our testing, and I should note that this is an engagement targeting like 12 to 27-year-olds. Anyone can use it, but that's really who we want to get the data out of. I won't go into all the details. So we built this thing, and this is not the actual kiosk that we built, but we had a similar kiosk that was built, and we were on site and realized our target demographic could not reach the display. So if you've ever missed something really obvious, and not even just you, but an entire team of people, 30 people all in, including the client, did not notice. Now, thankfully, we, as a company that did on-sites, had our carpenter deliver step-ups for the kids, like, within the hour. So we solved the problem, like, on-site, same day. But huge gaffe, and now that factored into our decision. We had been, just not thinking about everybody who'd be using the interface.
So we'll have some other examples peppered in, but if you've ever experienced anything like that, you might be suffering from organizational bias. So why does this matter? First of all, it's like a huge own goal. Like, it's something that's really avoidable, but it's an easy misstep to make. And you end up doing things like confusing users, obscuring information, adding steps and frustration to the user experience. When you create an experience that's poor in that way, it really detracts from like the user's goals and your organization's business goals. You also might end up building something that's too limited to catch on. And then like adoption doesn't happen, your team's reputation is maybe damaged, or you just end up with like a team that is like so ingrained in the way the organization does business that you just lose the ability to like look outside and even interpret what your users are saying.
Yeah, so let's talk about what we're hoping to produce today. Ambitiously, we're hoping to help introduce the concept of organizational bias, help define it, help get you acquainted with some resources that might be helpful to you. As we said, we're not experts, but we're going to do a definition. We're going to talk about how to potentially identify sources of bias, which is not as easy as it sounds, and then as one of the factors of that solution, how you can align your solutions to your users. So, recognizing organizational bias, how do we go about doing that? Well, before we do that, let's define it. So, McKinsey has a definition that I'm really partial to, which is that bias is a predisposition of a psychological, sociological, or physiological nature that can influence your decision making. I compress that down to structure. There's a structure that's influencing your decision making, and that's where that comes from. I like this definition, although you will see many other sources that talk about the explicit negative impact of bias, and that's certainly a thing we want to, that should be addressed. However, bias in a work context can awkwardly sometimes work for you as much as it can work against you. So it's particularly useful, though, to be able to recognize when that is happening, so that you can actually be informed about how you might be making decisions and not just operating from structure. Another key of this is that bias is pervasive. It is part of human nature. You cannot escape it. If you take this and you become an expert on bias somehow, you're not going to be able to perceive all sources of bias in the universe. That's just never going to happen. That's just not how things work. So because it's structurally reinforced, it's difficult to detect. Just understand that. An example of this is, let's say you grew up in a culture or in a universe where blue is the best color. You'd obviously be more likely to select a blue design palette or a blue color for your website design because you have this thinking, and no one would really be contesting that because the whole universe is reinforcing that structure. So although there's all these types of bias defined up here, and there's a great article about it that's linked in the deck, we're not going to be going into the nitty-gritty of each of these. I definitely encourage you to check out the resources in the deck because they do a much better job of describing each of these in examples than we will.
All right, so if it's so common and it's so often that like it's happening because you're sort of accustomed to it and you might not even see it, then how do we become aware of some of the symptoms of bias? Well, some of the things you might see, one is misaligned priorities, especially if you're focusing a lot on pet projects, appeasing leaders and stakeholders instead of like whatever is the actual valuable action. That often turns into prioritizing like organizational minutia, spending a lot of time like fiddling with org charts or team lists and other things that maybe are really important to how people inside see the organization, but not necessarily what you're trying to communicate to those that are using your website. In other words, that's like content that's really composed for the organization and not necessarily your audience. That's a good segue into jargon, which is another big one. So that's anytime you start using a lot of terms, terminology, whether in your content, in your navigation, that are super familiar to people in-house, like second nature, but maybe not understandable by your audience. Or maybe if they understand it, it's not what they're looking for. It's not what they're putting in the search engine. It's not what they're looking for in your navigation. So as an example, I worked for a long time with the PharmD program at UCSF and constantly struggled with this. There'd be things like APPEs, and they would just throw that out into the world. And even when they try to clarify it, it would sometimes be like, well, we'll call them pharmacy practice experiences. Well, it's like, well, that's kind of a term we just made up. And it's like, okay, well, what if we called them practice rotations like a lot of other medical and health professions do. Then people that are a little bit less familiar with the particular terminology of the profession can still find info about like, how does this like round out my learning? Another one that was really popular battleground for a while was calling it the block curriculum. What does that mean? No one knows what that means. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, let's talk about assumptions. Assumptions tend to be the root of many different types of biases. There's a couple things to look for when you're looking for how these are infiltrating your work. One is if you have a culture that's not having a significant array of points of view. If you're constantly indexing on a certain perspective and not calling that into question, that's called an absence of different sources and probably something you would want to look into a little bit further. Another way this manifests is in disregarding counter arguments or crushing dissent or however you want to phrase that. But this is, the idea that you're neglecting these counter arguments or you're excusing them without legitimate argumentation or assessment or validation of like, is this actually a legitimate concern or not? So when those are being dismissed, something to look out for. So if you have, as a team, or you see a leader, or you see a group of people who are acting in that way, maybe it's a good time to ask the question, should we actually investigate this further, or how can I restructure that? And we'll have some suggestions on that later. And very closely connected to both of these, often connected to it, is authority bias. We had an expert, and they said we should totally do this 2 years ago. We had a great example of this in the keynote this morning, where Lego brought in, can you remember?
Miracle Man.
The Miracle Man. Miracle Man did not yield the results as expected. Maybe with more time, who knows? But when we index on authority, we're not doing the appropriate due diligence to call into question. So look out for that as well. The easiest indicator for most people to start investigating bias is poor outcomes, because everyone starts asking questions when you have poor outcomes. That's how I initially got particularly interested in it. My manager, I worked for a CEO, he's like, why is this happening, Dana? I'm like, I have no idea. So we started doing some research and some data and actually got some answers. But the way that this will typically, the things that you should be looking out for is, hey, did we dot all our I's, cross all our T's, execute the project plan, and feel like we nailed it and then not get the outcome we expected? That's an indicator that maybe there's some sort of seated bias to investigate. An example of this is maybe your website is generating amazing traffic, but it doesn't work for screen readers. Or I'm sorry, this is an example of inequity. But same idea. That's another way this manifests, right? A poor outcome is you're performing well, but you're not performing equitably and charitably to all of your audience segments, which is, there's an idea of nobility there, which actually is someone who works at UCSF. We have a legal mandate to be accessible, so we have to do that. But if you're in private, you probably don't. But that's a missed market opportunity. And now, so why would you not want to potentially, access that market? So something to pay attention to there. And the key, or one thing that I'll note here, it's really difficult to discern whether the outcome is a result of bias or it's a result of your product or service just not meeting the market. So the only way to figure this out is to try doing some experiments and tests, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
All right, so a lot of this actually seems pretty obvious. So why does the bias persist? Well, one is that people are often just really comfortable with whatever the existing process is. We're often under pressure for quick results or to, appease the higher ups. Lack of research, you just didn't have the time or the effort spent to look sort of under the surface. And then the familiarity, like if you're in-house, this is your day-to-day, you're part of the org too, and you're used to how things work. So what are some things we can do to address this in our work and overcome bias? One is fostering empathy and embracing diversity, especially within your teams. So use things like personas, user stories, user feedback, anything you have access to actually like get everyone in your team like on board with like who you're trying to actually make stuff for. Similarly, consider the user journey. Whether you do this super formally or informally, like think about like what are your users doing, what do they need, what are they trying to get from our site. But then take it a step further and also think like what language do they use? Like how do they describe things? What's their mental model? Work on getting your stakeholders to also consider the audience perspective. If you're like an in-house team, this can actually be like one of the hardest things because we're kind of like got this idea. And if you're making content or building websites, you are thinking about those users way more than they are. So just like kind of evangelizing, like getting them to put themselves in their shoes as well can make a big difference. And then look at your team also. Like understand how diversity like impacts your ability to see bias, to recognize bias, but also that you have people on your team, regardless of how big or diverse your team is. If you have 3 people, you've got 3 different perspectives. Leverage those to like close your gaps and think more about things from many different perspectives. With all of these, a practice you can do on top of this is to share things that you learn, insights, testimonials, research findings. Try to share those to others in the org who are not maybe part of the web team. Build that baseline knowledge so that when you go to talk to them about like what you're actually doing or a project, you're not starting from like square one. You've built some shared knowledge together about what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So I think the thing that I've learned, or the thing that's helped me most in my career as a product professional, is research and data, and that's the weapon against bias. Otherwise, you're just probably creating new biases based on authority or whatever. So how do we do that? Obviously, analytics. There's that's. Everything listed here is something that you should be probably doing if you're running a modern website or a business and you want to know what's going on with it. Surveys, feedback forms. I think that's all common. Some of the key things to look for that might uncover bias is dead ends and journeys. Where's your drop-off points? Where are users saying, this is too much, I'm done, I'm out. They're already in, they're trying to do something. Abandoned shopping carts is a great example of this if you happen to run an e-commerce website, but most of us are probably not doing that. So look for where they're exiting. And that might be an indicator of either bad content or some opportunity to make that content more equitable for your audiences. There's a bunch of free tools that are available to you to do this. I think there's no excuse not to have analytics packages, accessibility indicators running on your site. It's important to set up a standard practice to review and assess this, though. This is what I see missing most in teams. Yeah, we got the analytics running. Well, who's looking at it? What decisions are we making on it? How frequently are we actually using this valuable resource that we have? Google allows you to cut that data in a billion different ways, or any modern analytics tool. And if you're not doing that as a routine practice as a team, you're consolidating knowledge, and that's generally a bad idea. You want the knowledge to be spread out evenly. Another key idea of this is in your testing teams or in your data review teams, consider the breadth of the profiles that you're using in your preliminary testing. If you're doing research validation, or you're in the early part of doing wireframes or visual design, make sure you have a broad psychographical cohort. This is something that I recognized when I was at that firm where we did the kiosk. If you looked over our dev room, it was the same profile 4 different times. I'm like, we can't do effective testing internally if this is our psychographic cohort. And so we started making some changes about that. And then, of course, I think if you're not already on the accessibility train, get on, because it's one of the easiest ways to start figuring out how your content and your website might be biased against underrepresented populations.
So once you've sort of done some research, started kind of enculturating your team, or even just yourself, then one of the big things to do is move to like a more user-centered approach, and I'll start aligning what you're doing with the user's perspective. Move away from the way the org sees it, move to what your users and visitors see. So, your design and content should reflect that, as well as things like your information architecture, navigation, labels, really through and through. So one way to do that is prioritize like those important journey touch points that are happening on the web. Or if that's not like the approach you're doing, at least like identify the top tasks that your visitors need to do and start moving that up your priority list. Move reflecting what the org thinks about itself down a little bit. Align with their mental models, use the language they use the structures they're going to expect. One great example, we had a website for current students, and it was completely organized around the 2 offices that serve students. And the first time we actually sat down, they were talking about this in the last talk I went to, which is actually talk to the end users. Everyone was always surrogating for the students. When we sat down with the students, they were immediately like, I don't know what office does what. Why is it organized this way? And it was immediately so apparent when they said that, because those students they're there for 3 years, and really not even, because they go out in the world and do rotations too. So why would they have this complex mental model of the offices and what their responsibilities are? They don't. They haven't been there that long. So it's just a great example of reorganizing around your users' expectations rather than what day to day.
Just following up on that point, I think certain organizations are more difficult than others. At UCSF, from the time I got employed, it took me about 1.5 years to figure out just how we were funded. And so, it's a difficult environment. Let's talk about how we convert some of these potential solutions into strategies and practices. So, as Eric talked about, and should be generally known, when you align your business to your user needs, you're going to get improved results over time, in general. That's a great idea. Cool. How do we figure out what our users prefer and desire? There's a lot of, we talked about data, we talked about ingesting that data and assessing it. That's one potential way to move about that. I'm going to go to some suggestions. I'm going to look this a different way. So I think another way to address this is to role play user scenarios, to understand user frustrations. Get with your team, especially your leadership. I think it's important to have leaders who are decision makers involved in this process, because if they understand how you're attempting to address these solutions, they'll be more receptive to when you fail in the future, which you definitely will do. So, so it's helpful if they understand how the practice is happening, because you're not going to nail it the first time. Bias, that's just not how it works. Bias is going to be present and doing its work. Retrospectives, another great tool. I wish we did more of them, and we did them more frequently at UCSF. So we're definitely guilty of not doing these as much as we should, but I definitely think the smaller you keep them and the more frequently you do them, the more valuable they are. You don't want to have this big brain dump at the end of a year-long project and then do all your learning then. Why not learn month 1 or week 1 and take some of that learning back into the project? A/B testing. So let's say, hey, I have a suspicion we're biasing our content or we're making an assumption here. Do an A/B test. It's a quick, easy way. You can do it on your live site. You can do it with test audiences, however you want to do it. Try to validate whether that's a bias or that's some other deficiency in your product, your website, whatever. So going back onto this leadership idea, it's really important to get aligned with them and to prep them, as I said, for potential failure. This is essentially a continual product improvement process, I think, and if you're not getting commitment from your leadership and they expect it to be nailed the first time, I think the counter argument is, well, I need a lot more money for testing. Don't make me go public and nail it right if we're not going to be allocating significant resources to internal testing and validation. And even then, I would say it's probably better just to get to market first anyways, because the market is the market and they'll actually tell you what you need to know rather than any sort of internal test. Structure your conversations with those decision makers so they're prepared for these changes. Like, you have to let them know, hey, we might uncover something that changes how we are doing our information architecture or how we're presenting this type of page. So a lot of leaders just want to know, when am I getting this done? And you have to reorient them around the quality of the delivery and the expected business outcome. If the business outcome is, hey, we're a center of excellence and we want to justify that on the web, having a crappy first impression is a surefire way not to accomplish your business goal. So make that the subtext for that conversation. And finally, emphasize moments of discovery related to this. So let's say you have identified a bias, you made a change, and you had a success. That's a time to really bring that, make sure that gets communicated as broadly and widely as possible, shared with other teams around the university or your organization.
Another thing you can do, especially if you're in content creation or sort of information architecture side of the thing, is really clear away that jargon. Use more clear communication. Here's some ways you can do that. For one, figure out what's the reading proficiency, the technical knowledge, what is your audience. That kind of thing goes back to those personas especially, but what are they going to understand, and then anchor into that. Identify and rephrase those technical terms or internal terms. So replace them with plain language if you can, or at least define them so that someone isn't just immediately lost if you need to use the terms for whatever reason. By doing that, you're going to really align the language with the user expectations. And I'm going to give you a little exercise to do over the rest of the week here, which is this is a sort of a technical environment. We've got our own language and way of doing things in the Drupal community. Think about jargon that you see throughout it's the last session for today, but tomorrow, think about jargon you see and how you might say that to someone who is not inculcated to this world already.
Yeah, and so I think another key idea here, especially when we're talking about strategies of converting to practices, is repetition, again, continual product improvement. Working against organizational bias can really feel insurmountable. Especially, there's times I certainly know in my career where I'm I can see that this is happening. And I'm trying to fight it or change it or make something else happen, and it's very difficult to do. And the answer to that is to just keep slowly, consistently, effectively pressing ahead. So maybe reduce your expectations. If you're trying a new practice, start really small. Just work on one data element, one piece of proof, one change that can help advance what you think is better for your institution. To support that, focus on actionable metrics. This is a real big thing. I've been in the past, and you go to whoever your lead is, and you're our page views are doing this, and our bounce rate is doing this. They don't care. Am I making money? Are we getting the transactions we want? Are we getting the registrations we want? What does the actual business care about? And make sure you're speaking in those terms, and you're monitoring that in what and your evaluations. We talked about doing A/B testing. And I think the other key idea here is to develop training. If you're going to do all this exercise, make sure you're building it into part of your actual operational practice. Write the documentation, show someone else how to test, get it actionable throughout your entire org tree, and build these as routine practices that hopefully are budgeted and rewarded by your leadership. Say, hey, if we want to do this, it needs to be a line item on my KPI so that I get evaluated by this at the end of the year. So let's wrap it all up. Some takeaways. First, accept your organizational bias is going to be an ongoing, is this doing its thing?
Yeah.
Good, okay. An inescapable aspect of your work. You cannot get away from this. Once you accept that that's the case, you're going to do your best to recognize it and then address it. And as we talked about, there's a couple ways that you can address it. Essentially, you want to develop practical tools in the language that decision makers care about, that you can test, iterate, and validate your solutions and changes. So carry that forward. Oh, I see we got a fun thing going on here. You want to create practices that align to your goals with user needs. Yeah, we'll go, that was supposed to happen first. We've done this deck 100 times.
Yeah.
So you want to create practices that align your goals with user needs. And I think most importantly, if there only one thing happens out of this, foster a team, a unit, a business culture. However, if you have to start small, start with 2 people, then get it to 3, that respects all opinions and encourages critical input. You can't do any of this unless people feel comfortable and safe having difficult conversations and expressing their true feelings about things. So a safe work environment is really critical to that, one that's inclusive as well, of course.
And I think you can start even smaller than 2. You can start with 1. Because really, like, any kind of, like, perspective shift is like a mindset thing. So I want to challenge everyone here to, like, just think about, like, what's like one thing that you can do in the course of your work the next few days, weeks, that is a step towards more user-centric thinking. Like, how does that change your mindset and how you think about things? So there's also some resources we wanted to share. So this will be in the deck. I don't know if you wanted to point out anything in particular.
The slide that has all the cool types of organizational bias is that last one from the Strategy Institute. I highly recommend that. That'll get you well primed and was core to putting this together. The others, actually, a real interesting book I listed there. You have to buy it on Amazon. Is that Psychology of a Website, Mastering Cognitive Biases. It's kind of written from the perspective of some business perspective, trying to really master delivering your content and like using biases to like their advantage. But it's a really interesting insight into the flip side of how biases get manipulated by marketers. And if you're aware of that, then you can bring that knowledge to your work.
Also, if you're interested just in like how this applies like to the work, David Dylan Thomas has a recent Design for Cognitive Bias book, but he also does a podcast just all about cognitive bias, and lots of talks you can find really interesting. And then I'll also point out this article about what really matters, focusing on top tasks. When I read that, I felt personally attacked, and it was basically a through line between like reading that and exploring this and ending up at this presentation. So here's our contact info if you want to reach out to Dana or I, and we're now open for like any questions or discussion that you might have.
The one thing I thought was interesting was you were saying don't use jargon, but here's the thing. So your users, the faculty, the students, etc., in your internal search may use, like you use the term KPI.
Mm-hmm.
So they may search for, I know medical students aren't going to search for KPI.
Right.
For example, say with something else, having a page that had KPI, key performance indicators, and here's information about the things you most care about. So jargon is not necessarily bad if it gets your users to your information.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, that's right. That's completely right. So I think what we were trying to say really is like jargon is something to be on the lookout for, because you might be assuming that your audience knows that jargon or is searching for that jargon, but they might not know it, or they might not understand it till they're part of the organization. But certainly, like, it can be just as important just to make sure that you're using if that is the language that they're using, you want to make sure that you are using that and that you have those key terms also. Yeah,
jargon isn't
point.
bad. Jargon is just something you should be attentive to because it may be hurting you more than it's helping you.
Yeah.
Your search keywords can determine whether your users actually use that jargon.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great piece of data to look at. What are people searching for? Where are they ending up? And I like to see how long are they spending on that page. Because it could be an indicator, depending on what the information is, it could either be, oh wow, they found what they needed, great, and they're done. So they're only there for 30 seconds. Or it could be, this is not what I want, and I left probably less than that. Right, yeah. So, I mean, but I think tying those two things together, search data is always a great way to start thinking about how to recompose your content. One of the things I'm really ambitious about hopefully getting one day at ECSF is for someone who's composing content in Drupal to actually be able to see what the search terms are that are landing on their page as they're composing so that they can better compose their content. I think that would really help the editors at the institution.
So I often ask this, how much do you allocate for user research at your organization?
That's a Dana
Yeah,
question.
that's a good question. I have a real interesting relationship with user research over the years. As I said before, my personal bias is to get to market quickly with a testable product. So it may not be your initial product offering, the one that you're going to launch, but get something tested in the market that you're trying to access is much more important to me than doing structured, what's considered user research in some cases. We have a firm come in taking internal people, they might not be of the right profile, and then you're asking to do something they're already acquainted with. I've had focus groups that yield awesome results and then the product is dead on arrival. I've had focus groups go terribly and that product sails off the charts. So while it's a data point, I want all data that I can get. So if I can do the user research and I can get something to market and I can poll internally and externally, I want all of that so I can get a composite that I can start to frame my offering around. Just not always possible with budget. So I think the short answer is choose the path that is, optimal given whatever. If you're talking about a website, probably makes sense to have at least some minimal tests on the wireframes or the visual comps with ideally the audience that's most closely approximating your external users. Because you may not want to be able, like a website's kind of tricky to stand up like a dummy version of, right? You don't, like the second it's out there, it's out there. So that's a little tricky, but yeah.
In my prior role, it was often almost none. Like it was just we weren't resourced for it, and you're often trying to do everything on a shoestring. Many of those examples that I gave, though, came out of the rare moments where we got to do that. And that's why they stuck with me so much, because you just realize, like, the instant you do a tiny bit of research, you always uncover something new. So, super important. And another reason that I think that this topic is really important, which is that if you don't have the resources to regularly do that, or like in the last, I think you asked that question in the last talk I was at, and he said somewhere close to like 30% of the project budget, which is like, that's great. Like that's why they, they're figuring out a lot then, saving a lot of time later. But if you don't have that luxury because you are an in-house team or you have really limited things, you're constantly under your day-to-day, take any opportunity you can get.
Yeah. And I think your question was like, how much do we advocate for it? I write it in every budget.
Allocate.
Yeah, I allocate
Okay.
for it, and then if it gets cut, it gets cut. But at least I did my best to get some form of that in the project.
On the latest project you did, this pause, how much resources going into research versus development?
Yeah, well, we've already spent over half the allocated budget on stakeholder discovery and doing technical and content and design assessments of the suite of websites that we're building this platform for. So, yeah, that's more than we anticipated. But ideally, in general, when we're scoping projects, we plan for about 35 to 40% to be based on discovery, which may not include any design comps. Right. Just talking to people, understanding the business and what the business is trying to produce. Yeah, and we've.
that's definitely part of our process. Is we try to spend, I'd say, a third of our time in discovery, and a lot of that's user research.
Yeah. Yeah, I have another presentation I did at a UC Tech on actually how we do that. So if you're curious about that, I can talk to you offline.
Oh, yeah,
Any other questions? Anyone have a favorite bias?
Anyone have a good story? Big surprise, yeah.
This is sort of funny. So I don't know if it's across the whole UC system, but there was an organizational bias training, or recognizing confirmation bias. That's what it was. Right?
Okay.
And so it was a training we all had to take. And just as the demo, they we're going to show you pictures, and some are going to be from Southern California, and some are going to be from Northern California. You need to tell me, whether you like it from some scale or something, right? To see if you're biased towards Northern or Southern California. I was born and raised in Northern California. I love Northern California. I took the thing. Apparently, I like Southern California.
You traitor. You traitor.
See?
Yeah.
One of your first slides was showing how professors don't read their email. I'm married to a professor, so I can confirm that that's true.
Yeah.
We had a new product that for users to see examples of assessment questions, for at K through 12.
Okay.
Figuring out what should this be called. The CEO's doesn't matter. I want it to be called Interim Assessment Item Portal. So it's super long, but everybody says IIP. It's really hard to say that acronym very fast, and nobody knows what it's for.
Yeah.
It makes it hard.
Yeah. Working at a university, acronyms are the bane of my existence. And then sometimes we'll just spell it out. Well, that's worse. So what's the solution?
Well, and back to your point, if that's what the thing's called, that's what it is. It's hard not to call it that,
Or both. That was
Right.
part of my point.
Yeah.
You can have IAM and identity and access management, but okay, medical students say, how do I get my sign-up?
Yeah.
So put all of those things on the page.
Yeah, we're working on an intranet project at UCSF, and we're looking into AI filtered search, which I think is obviously one of the, if you can afford to implement one of those solutions, a great way to hopefully start to address some of those problems. So you're not putting as much emphasis on the content creator side to compose, because that's a challenge that we constantly have. It's okay, build me the best, most formulated page that is a source of truth for this item, and they do that, but then they may not be a communication professional, and they certainly may not be a web communication professional, and so what you get isn't really doing what you need it to do, and you get long program pages, with no snapshot summary at the top, and it's a nightmare.
Are you both in your IT group, or are you in a different?
Yeah, I'm in IT web services at UCSF.
Yeah, and I recently started working with them. Yeah, I was previously in a department, so in a very different sort of situation, which is where a lot of those experiences come from.
It's easier being in IT to ask folks to do discovery user research than it is for school.
Yeah, we used to be in comms,
Mm-hmm.
and then our web services team moved to IT years ago. It was the reason that we're trying to work together.
Yeah, along with organizational bias, just the structure of your institution is a bias, right? And at UCSF, for instance, we're bottom up, we're heavily fragmented and siloed, and the power is very distributed. So when I tell people I work at a university, especially if they're not from California and they don't know anything about it, they're oh, that must be easy for you. It's just a nice top-down, build the thing, you have one site to manage. And I'm oh yeah, no, it's not complete opposite, it's chaos. And so yeah, I think being honest with yourself when you're in a development group about the realities of the structure you have to operate in is very important. And we all complain about it, but the question is, what actions are we actually taking to try and mitigate it? How are we trying to work more cross-functionally? My team's built really strong relationship with Office of Communications, who is our comms connection, and that's been one nice bridge. But we have many that we haven't built. We're completely disconnected from health, for instance. So now that's something that we're trying to work on too. So, yeah. Any other questions, comments, or stories?
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming.
Miller time. Thank you.